detect those planets, image them. It's a really hard problem because it's like looking for a firefly next to a lighthouse in terms of the brightness of the planet and the brightness of the star. But I mean, imagine if you found a sun-like star and were able to detect an Earth-like planet around it. That could really, increase our chances of finding a habitable location besides our Earth elsewhere in the galaxy.
Well, it's so exciting, and I appreciate you talking to me today.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
SpaceX, the company founded by Elon Musk, is planning to launch the first space flight with an all-civilian crew. The spacecraft will orbit the Earth for several days, sometime in the fall. It will be a 4-person crew led by an American billionaire and pilot, Jared Isaacman, who is paying SpaceX an undisclosed sum of money for the flight. Also selected for the flight, a young woman who beat the odds against bone cancer. When it lifts off, she will become the youngest American in space. Plugged In's Elizabeth Chernoff has her story.
So I'm going to space.
Haley Arsenault is 29, a cancer survivor, and now she could become the youngest American person ever to fly into space.
As one for all.
Getting this call to go to space came out of completely nowhere. And but I think that's the beauty of life, is sometimes it surprises you.
The opportunity has come her way through her workplace, St. Jude Children's Research Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee. It was where she was treated as a child battling bone cancer.
So when I was 10 years old, I was working my way towards my black belt. And I had actually just gotten my black belt in Taekwondo before I was diagnosed with cancer. But I started having knee pain. And they thought it was from overuse from the Taekwondo. But then I started limping, and my mom noticed a big knot above my left knee. And she took me to the doctor, who did an x-ray. And I'll never forget, she came in the room with me and my parents and just said, "This is bone cancer."
My disease is called osteosarcoma, and it's a bone cancer. It's very serious. If you don't catch it fast, it spreads.
I spent a year at St. Jude undergoing intense chemo and then also surgery to save my leg. And as difficult as that year was physically, it was the most meaningful year of my life.
Arsenault now works at St. Jude as a physician assistant. She was chosen by the hospital and billionaire philanthropist Jared Isaacman to fly on the private Inspiration4 SpaceX mission later in 2021.
3, 2, 1, 0.
It will be the first space flight without an astronaut aboard, but before liftoff, there's training to be done.
It'll start with the centrifuge training, like going around really fast to feel all the G-forces. And then we're just going to prepare for any possible situation. We're going to spend a lot of time in the Dragon simulator. And then I'll get some additional preparation as I'm the medical officer of this flight.
Unlike the NASA and SpaceX flights that go to the International Space Station, this one will travel around Earth for several days, during which time Arsenault said she expects to participate in science experiments and also make time to video call kids at the hospital.
I really hope to inspire these kids by going on this mission, that to dream big, that they can do anything. I was talking to this little girl yesterday, and she was saying that she's upset that she can't run or jump. And I said, I can't run or jump either because I have a prosthesis in my leg. But I said, that's not stopping me from going to space. And so, this mission is opening space travel up to anyone. And I think that in itself is going to motivate people and give them so much hope. Kids are so visual, and I hope that them being able to see me in space really shows them what their future can look like. I'm the first St. Jude patient to go to space, the first pediatric cancer survivor, but I know I'm not going to be the last.
The United States is not alone with a mission to the Red Planet. United Arab Emirates and China have missions to Mars. The UAE says space has opened a broad range of possibilities for everyone in the Arab world.
The Martian surface has never been so popular for Earthling vessels. In July 2020, the United States, the United Arab Emirates, and China launched missions to the Red Planet. At the time, Earth and Mars had the type of ideal alignment that only happens every 26 months. Sarah Alamiri is chair of the UAE Space Agency. She says the years-long journey to build and launch a craft could inspire other Arab nations.
Today you have households of every single age group passionate about space, understanding a lot of science that happens in there. It's opened a broad realm for possibilities for everyone within the UAE and also, and I truly hope, within the Arab world.
The UAE's orbiter fired its main engines for 27 minutes to enter the Martian atmosphere in what's being called the Hope maneuver. It took another 17 minutes for nervous scientists on Earth to learn the good news. The following footage comes from Chinese state television, and VOA cannot independently verify its content. It claims to show scientists at the moment China's Tianwen-1 probe entered orbit around Mars. The Chinese craft executed a similar slowdown technique to the UAE's Hope maneuver. Tianwen-1 will stay in a so-called parking orbit to survey the surface, looking for potential landing sites in May or June. Arash Arbasadi, VOA News.
The competition for natural resources is making space the next frontier to mine for minerals needed for the next generation of batteries, electronics, and military equipment. Jim Green is chief scientist at NASA. Among his achievements is leading the 2012 mission landing the rover Curiosity on Mars. I asked him about the benefits of space exploration programs.
Well, what's happening in many ways is humans are leaving low Earth orbit. Our plans are then to trek to the moon, learn to live and work on a planetary surface, and then investigate Mars into the future. Mars is a pretty spectacular place. I mean, it is a planet that we can actually live and work on like none other. So we're interested from a scientific point of view. Its history. How did it come together? You know, what is it made of? Are there resources there? Can and how would we live there? And it tells us a lot about the potential for maybe a place where life could have started, when life started here on Earth. We've got to learn to live and work on a planetary surface. We want to be able to tease out the resources that are on the moon. We believe there's actually a significant amount of water in frozen form, trapped in permanently shadowed craters in the south and north pole of the moon, which is why we're going to the South Pole. Once we learn how to extract that and begin to use that, because we can breathe the oxygen that comes from water, we can, of course, drink the water. We also can create rocket fuel. That's actually some of the first things that we want to do when we go to Mars.
And have any of the discoveries been of benefit here on Earth? Any of the discoveries from the space station or any of our exploration?
Oh, there's been an enormous number of discoveries that have occurred on space station that we're using here on Earth. We're learning that in space without gravity, certain types of things like crystals can grow. We also learn that changes in the body that are not related to the gravity then can be really looked at more carefully. And therefore, we've seen a variety of medical advances that have occurred from space station astronauts.
All right, we had a space race with the Soviet Union, which led to the man on the moon. We got there first. Are we in a space race, for instance, now with China? I mean, is there competition? And good competition. I don't necessarily mean, a bad competition.
Right. Yeah. Competition from our perspective is always good. We're excited to see what the Chinese are doing. They have plans also to land on the moon. They have several rovers there now. We're turning our attention to do that. They've started to build a space station. That's exciting. So they're discovering some of the major scientific activities that we have been working in for several decades. So this kind of work is very healthy between these nations.
And what are other nations doing?
Some nations are getting into this concept of getting more commercial companies going. I know the Japanese are, and a couple are starting up in Europe too. So it's a model, I think, that's going to leave the U.S. and go into many of these other countries to be followed.
And is NASA now working with private companies? Is that something a little bit different?
It is different, and it's really a very important part of the whole plan. And the concept is, of course, getting more companies having the ability to get into space, because we have the space station. SpaceX and Blue Origin and a number of others can allow transportation back and forth. That enables us to turn our attention to these grander plans about going to the moon.
Are the private companies and NASA working well together, or is there some stepping on feet and duplication of what the private enterprise is doing and what NASA is doing?
What you're looking at on your screen.
Well, the private companies together form a competitive network, as we always like to have. You know, we always are looking for the best price for the best product. So that's going on. But from our perspective, it's a really healthy environment because we have a number of companies and groups to work with.
What are you most interested in seeing in this, in Perseverance? I mean, what's the one sort of thing, like, you know, you want to see if it could do?
Well, what it will be doing that we really want is it will be coring rock. And in fact, here's an example of one of the cores. It looks like a piece of chalkboard chalk or Crayola creme, depending on what era you're born in. We don't use chalkboards anymore these days. But we want to core rock in certain places where there's sediments in these deltas, where life may have really come down these rivers and then deposited and created the rock that we see today. And then we want to bring those sediments back. Just like the Apollo rocks, we want to be able to interrogate these in our laboratory and really tease out the history of Mars through the rock record.
Well, Perseverance got a core and gather those rocks. Does it deposit it someplace, and how do we get those rocks back to Earth?
The plan is that we will go to a location and create several cores. We put those cores in a metal sleeve, all right? And then that is sealed, and then we lay that on the surface and then move on to other areas. So we will be leaving these samples on the surface for later pickup.
And what's later pickup?
Well, we're planning those missions right now. That's the next thing.
Are we alone in this universe?
So my answer to that is, this is why we're going to Mars and why we're looking out beyond our solar system for planets that are more Earth-like to determine if we are alone or not.
All right, so we have the moon, we have Mars. Looking beyond that, what do you see NASA doing?
Well, Moon and Mars is going to be enough for, in terms of human exploration, for sure, for the next several hundred years. But, you know, NASA's doing a lot in many other ways. We have missions that are currently at Jupiter. We have one that's way out in the outer part of the solar system. The Voyagers are still working, and we've gone into the Kuiper Belt with New Horizons. So we have quite a spectacular program all over the solar system.
Jim, thank you for talking to me, and thank you for your work. I got to tell you, I'm a big fan of NASA. It's very inspirational. It's very exciting, and I would have loved to have been part of the space program in some way. I chose the wrong career.
Well, there's always room for you, Greta. Come on. You can come help us anytime you'd like. Thank you so much for inviting me.
That's all the time we have for now. Thank you to my guests, NASA Chief Scientist Jim Green, Matt Smith, Systems Engineer for the Mars rover Perseverance. Keep up with the latest news at voanews.com, and do follow me on Twitter @Greta. And we leave you with more of the amazing images from Mars. Thank you for being plugged in.
COVID-19 transformed the way we do business. Now more than ever, fast lead generation and customer retention will determine if a business survives or not. The Now Media Video Business Card is designed to be sent using your smartphone. It's the next generation business card that will open the door for you while keeping social distancing. The Now Media Video Business Card is affordable for anyone from startups to multinational companies and is already being used by hundreds of businesses. Stay open, stay in business. Call us today.
Unplugged in, Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny imprisoned and unsure of his fate.
We thought the Kremlin is unlikely to go after somebody that they're at the same time bad-mouthing because it would make it too obvious who went after them. In Navalny's case, they did both.
After surviving a poisoning, the Putin critic is pushed further into Russia's prison system.
We imposed Russia sanctions on Alexei Navalny's poisoning and detention.
Beyond new sanctions, how might the new American president change the U.S. relationship with Moscow? Unplugged in, U.S.-Russia, sanctions and policy. Hello and welcome to Plugged In. I'm Greta Van Susteren, reporting from Washington, D.C. Alexei Navalny says he's being held about 100 kilometers from Moscow in what he calls a real concentration camp. Russia's opposition leader was jailed in January after returning to Russia after an attempt to kill him by poison. Navalny was sentenced to prison for parole violations dating back a few years. Navalny's lawyer confirms his client was recently transferred to Penal Colony No. 2 in Russia's Vladimir region. Navalny's jailing sparked protests across Russia and generated demands from around the world for his release. In response to the jailing, the United States imposed new economic sanctions.
It's clear that Russian officials targeted Mr. Navalny for his activism and his efforts to reveal uncomfortable truths about Russian officials' corruption and to give voice to Russian citizens' legitimate grievances with their government and its policies. We are exercising our authorities to send a clear signal that Russia's use of chemical weapons and human rights abuses have severe consequences.
With its new leader now in prison, Russia's opposition movement faces an uncertain future with parliamentary elections. Those elections are scheduled for September. VOA's Charles Maines tells us more from Moscow.
Vladimir Oblast, less than 100 kilometers from Moscow. The prison Alexei Navalny will call home for at least the next 2.5 years is said to be among Russia's most oppressive and brutal. And it's just one of many ways the government continues to apply pressure on the opposition figure and those seeking political change. Opposition candidates and municipal deputies gathered recently in Moscow to discuss strategies for competing in the country's fall elections, asking how to beat the odds and win local races against a Kremlin-backed political machine. They never got their answer. Police broke up the proceedings, arguing the event had ties to a foreign NGO the state deemed undesirable in 2017. With the entire conference placed under arrest, those who were there described it as an exercise in the absurd.
The events in our country of late are such that the writer Franz Kafka could only envy. He couldn't possibly have had enough imagination to make this up.
Fear has become the Kremlin's primary tactic as it tries to keep government opponents off the ballot and clearly off the streets. Thousands were detained during protests that followed Navalny's detention, with many kept in grim conditions and family members in the dark.
I couldn't get any information at all. You call and they tell you nothing. And now, only at midnight, did I find out he was at the prison here.
While others subsequently faced a more Soviet response to political dissent.
We were waiting for our coup to take place. We were waiting inside the van, right beside the court. And there I read, I was fired from the institution where I used to work.
With the government promising further crackdowns, Navalny's allies called for a moratorium on street protests until the spring.
If we keep coming out every week, thousands more will be arrested and hundreds beaten.
They're pushing instead for more symbolic acts and rallying international pressure. The U.S. and European allies have both demanded Navalny's release. They've also joined in imposing sanctions against high-ranking Russian officials, even if it's with the knowledge, say observers, that the measures change the Kremlin's calculus only so far.
They're not effective, and I'm not sure that there are any kind of sanctions that could influence what happens inside the country. I think the only purpose these sanctions serve is a kind of a signal to Kremlin that what happened is not unnoticed.
Yet Navalny's attacks on government corruption and his growing profile at home and abroad clearly has the Kremlin's attention as well. After years of treating him as politically irrelevant, the Kremlin now prefers the opposition figure out of the picture, whatever the cost. Charles Maines for VOA News, Moscow.
I spoke to Charles Maines for a sense of the political climate in Moscow and whether Navalny's jailing is affecting Vladimir Putin's grip on power. Can you tell me the political climate right now in Moscow and in Russia, if there's a way to describe it?
Well, I think it's clear that you've seen these very significant events over the last half year, starting with the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, his evacuation in a coma to Germany, his resurrection, he recovered, and then made this kind of amazing return to Russia. I mean, these are big, big events unfolding. And, on the one hand, we saw, of course, people come out on the streets, but it didn't seem to kind of fundamentally change anything. I think there was an assumption from Navalny and his allies that this would put pressure and really transform the political situation here. What we've seen, though, is, of course, with these protests and against Mr. Navalny himself, repression. Fear seems to be the government's main tactic. We saw it in the way that they've sentenced Alexei Navalny to over 2.5 years in prison for these past alleged parole violations, while not investigating his poisoning. And at the same time, we've also seen, over 10,000, 11,000 people arrested over a series of protests in January and February. Just over this past weekend, I was at a pro-democracy forum where municipal candidates were gathering just to talk strategies for the fall elections here in Russia. That was met with police. They stormed the conference and arrested the entire conference. So repression seems to be the main factor here.
Has the jailing of Navalny had any impact on Putin's grip on power?
I think before the sense was that if they gave him a long-term prison sentence, that this would invite protests at home and also a lot of condemnation abroad. But now what we see is a moment where Russia is being condemned for other things already. So the idea of more sanctions on sanctions doesn't have quite as much of a bite. And Navalny himself it's also become very personal between Mr. Putin and Mr. Navalny. He released a video claiming corrupt practices by Mr. Putin, allegedly having this sort of incredible palace in the south of Russia along the Black Sea. There seems to be some truth to it. And although Mr. Putin, I should say, has denied the charges, but a good friend of his claimed to now own the property. But this has suddenly really kind of intruded into Mr. Putin's private circles. And I think that seems to have kind of personalized this conflict between these two men to the point where Putin is out to punish him.
Do you have any sense of what Navalny's followers would like to see the United States do or not do vis-a-vis Navalny?
They've made it quite clear they disagree with the United States for issuing what they call sectoral sanctions. So targeting the Russian economy. They see that essentially rallying Russians around Putin or the government per se. And so what they're suggesting is a list of what they call the financiers of Mr. Putin or some of his closest advisors or his friends and his cronies. And they think essentially that's the way to target the Russian government and not target the Russian people. Certainly what they've seen from the Biden administration at this point, they're hoping it's just the beginning. We've seen essentially sanctions against 8 high-ranking Russian government officials, some concerns, some organizations as well that allegedly have ties to chemical weapons development, but not against the financiers, which seems to be a key issue for Navalny's allies.
What do you think is going to happen in the elections in September? Any thought?
If you go back to the poisoning this past August, Mr. Navalny was actually traveling in Siberia trying to rally people around this smart voting campaign that he and his team essentially had come up with. And the idea was to target the unpopularity of the ruling United Russia Party, and that's by pooling votes towards one candidate in particular. So they didn't care who they were, what their views were, but as long as they weren't affiliated with the Kremlin, they would target all the votes this way. And they ran this campaign in 2019 as kind of a test run. And it did have some effectiveness in some races, in some towns. Not everywhere, but certainly in Moscow it did, in some towns in Siberia it did. And you know, there was some sense that there's concern there that this could happen again. So it'll be interesting to see if they can keep that momentum going without sort of Mr. Navalny's charisma, use of social media, if people will stay kind of involved in the fight with essentially the leader of it behind bars.
A few days after Navalny's January arrest, his anti-corruption foundation released a video on social media. His foundation claims the video shows a billion-dollar palace built by friends of Russian President Vladimir Putin. The Kremlin has dismissed the claims, and they have not been independently verified. But the video of a lavish palace has generated hundreds of millions of views on YouTube, raising Navalny's profile in Russia. We have a report from our sister network, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty.
This is an artist's impression of a strip club in a secret palace for the enjoyment of Russian President Vladimir Putin, according to a new YouTube video with tens of millions of views.
This room is also equipped with a large stage and an extraordinary thing. The stage has an elevator with a pole. We can't imagine what a pole on a stage is for.
The video was made by opposition leader Alexei Navalny and posted by his supporters after he was jailed. He claims to have received leaked floor plans of the vast palace, which allegedly includes a casino, a theatre, extensive vineyards, an ice rink and luxury bathrooms, where even the Italian-made toilet brush costs $800. The many allegations in the almost 2-hour video could not be independently verified, and the Kremlin quickly dismissed them. But they are Navalny's latest salvo in an ongoing battle with Putin.
Putin's friends, having received from him the right to steal everything they want in Russia, have repaid him in many ways. But they also chipped in, collected $1.35 billion, and built a palace for their boss.
Navalny was detained on arrival at a Moscow airport on January the 17th, prompting a chorus of international criticism. He had just returned from Berlin, where he was being treated after being poisoned by a Novichok nerve agent in August last year. Investigations by Navalny's team, Bellingcat and other media presented extensive evidence that it was carried out by Russia's Federal Security Service. The Kremlin denies involvement, and pro-government media have been almost silent about all of this. But it appears to have raised Navalny's profile in Russia nonetheless.
The whole story of the poisoning drew the attention of a large number of people, and we have seen that the interest in his return has been pretty high. Of course, we can't say that the whole country has been glued to its screens to follow it, but there is pretty high interest, at least among the digital audience.
This is not the first time that the existence of the palace on the Black Sea coast has been reported. What's new in Navalny's report is the level of detail about the property and how it was allegedly financed with state funds stolen by Putin allies. But Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said the video is just a rehash of old claims and noted that it includes an appeal for donations to Navalny's anti-corruption fund.
This is the real scam, and we warn all citizens, especially since the video has so many views. Think before transferring money to such crooks.
Navalny is being held in custody pending a hearing on whether he broke the terms of a suspended sentence relating to a previous conviction for embezzlement. Outside Russia, the conviction was widely seen as part of Kremlin efforts to silence Navalny, but he now faces up to 3.5 years in prison.
The Biden administration has declassified an intelligence report that shows in August of 2020, Russia's FSB intelligence agency plotted the poisoning of Alexei Navalny. Navalny survived the poisoning and identified the plotters. He did so with the help of Christo Grozev, a top researcher with Bellingcat. Bellingcat is an investigative journalism platform specializing in the use of open-source intelligence. I spoke to Grozev about how they tracked down the men who tried to kill Navalny by poisoning him.
We learned a lot of things. The first part of our discovery process led us to a team of poisoners working for the FSB, for a unit called the Criminalistics Institute of the FSB, that actually tailed Navalny for almost 5 years before the poisoning. They were always at his heels whenever he went to a campaign trip around Russia, or even on a vacation trip with his wife. They picked only times that he traveled with an overnight stay over, so they never followed him on day trips, which suggests they might have been interested only in hotel stays as a possible place of poisoning. And we noticed that these were not just regular FSB people, and that was the crucial finding. They were not only political police, as one unit of the FSB is called colloquially. There were some political police people, but on every single trip there was also a team of a chemist and a doctor. A chemist with expertise in chemical weapons, and a doctor also with expertise in treatment of chemical weapons or use of chemical weapons. So this is a picture that got developed in front of our eyes, a team that had traveled with Navalny, alongside Navalny, without him knowing, on more than 35 trips over the last 5 years. And we placed these same people near the location of his hotel in Tomsk. A couple of days earlier, near the location of his hotel in Novosibirsk, where he was initially traveling to. And departing or moving away from the hotel about an hour after he went to bed on the night on which we suspect he was poisoned. So everything pointed to a targeted operation by an FSB clandestine unit. But that was only the first part we discovered. The second part was even more shocking. It was the scale of the operation of this particular unit. It was not an ad hoc operation to poison Navalny. It was an operation that apparently had been targeting many, many other not only opposition figures in Russia, but also human rights activists, journalists, and in one particular case that we are yet to disclose, an author, a writer, a poet. So the scale of this is still to be determined, but we see that we're talking about definitely more than 10 people that were at the crosshairs of this unit.
How were you able to identify these flights? What was your technique for learning this?
We used a combination of open source and partially closed source data. Over the years, we've accumulated a pretty significant database of, a collection of leaked databases of, for example, outdated travel data. For example, one database includes about 50% of all air travel in Russia from the period 2014-2017. Another database includes leaked passport data and residence data for a number of cities in Russia. So the combination of these to what we call open source sources, because they are in the public domain. You can download them on torrents, and a lot of Russian journalists have done that. Allows us to look for patterns. So, for example, in this particular case, we had identified some people who had traveled with Navalny at every single trip that he took across the country. And that allowed us, through correlation analysis, to pinpoint about 6 people that were suspiciously always traveling with him. Many of them traveled on joint bookings, which allowed us to connect them to one another. That gave us the first hypothesis that there's this team of people who always tail Navalny. Then we had to cross into closed sources data. For that, we had to approach whistleblowers, in some cases, even people who are just selling data on the open market in Russia. There are a lot of data brokers in Russia that traditionally sell data, not to journalists, and they're quite unhappy when they find out they sold it to journalists, but they sell it to companies who do surveillance on their own employees in Russia, or are doing due diligence checks on applicants for jobs. And we got from some of these whistleblowers and or data sources, data brokers, we got phone records, what in Russia they call billing records, which is basically metadata on a particular number, time of call, place of location of the phone, when the call was made. So we were able to get the phone records for these particular 6 people that later expanded to 8 as a total. And we saw that they were communicating with top FSB officials just before the trips with Navalny. And more importantly, they were talking to chemical weapons specialists from exactly the same institute that we had identified in the previous research just before trips with Navalny.
Was there any way to tie it to Putin directly in your research?
Well, I mean, what we saw was them communicating with people at the FSB directorate level. So these are people that would be deputy to Bortnikov. Bortnikov is the chief of the FSB. And we saw this team talking to deputies of Bortnikov. Bortnikov is in direct contact. He directly reports to Putin. The concept of Putin not being aware or having ordered this operation, but let's limit it to not having been aware, is zero. That we've talked to a lot of people that were formerly serving in Russian security services and now live abroad. They've all told us that there's no way that anybody at the FSB would be authorized to go near a chemical weapon without the approval of the FSO, the president's own personal security service, simply for the fact that this is too dangerous, because somebody who gets access to such a high-grade poison might just go crazy and start attacking even the president. So the president needs to be in the know anytime somebody at any security service uses chemical weapons.
Were you able to speak or interview Mr. Navalny? And he also himself was part of discovering who it was who had poisoned him. Is that right?
Well, not him himself. We tried to firewall him from the discovery process, but we invited members of his own investigation team, the people that do anti-corruption investigations in Russia. And one of the key investigators, Maria Pevchik, she joined us at the last stage of our investigation. We made sure that Alexei Navalny is only informed at the last moment. So basically a week before we published, we brought him into the picture, just because we didn't want his own perception to bias our investigation. But yes, we brought him in at the last moment. We did have to get data from him through his chief investigator about his own travel. So that's what he was sharing with us, but without really knowing until late in the process who exactly were his would-be poisoners.
Your investigative journalism is just incredible, but you're dealing with very serious topics. Do you have any fear for your life?
Obviously, and especially after we found out for ourselves that this FSB unit had been after Navalny while Navalny was at the crosshairs of the propaganda campaign of the Kremlin. We thought the Kremlin is unlikely to go after somebody that they're at the same time bad-mouthing, because it would make it too obvious who went after them. In Navalny's case, they did both. And they've been the Russian government has been so vocal about accusing Bellingcat and me and my colleagues of being a mouthpiece of Western intelligence and of being spies and of being traitors and what have you, that we have to start getting concerned.
Due to the poisoning of Navalny, the U.S. government announced economic sanctions. The sanctions are directed against several top Russian officials. The U.S. also reiterated demands that the opposition leader be released. But no sanctions were specifically directed at President Vladimir Putin or his inner circle. VOA White House correspondent Patsy Widakuswara tells us more.
This penal colony about 100 kilometers east of Moscow is where outspoken Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny has been jailed since last month after surviving a poison attack last year. The Biden administration declassified intelligence showing that Moscow orchestrated the poisoning and announced sanctions on 14 Russian entities and 7 senior members of the Russian government.
Expansion of sanctions under the Chemical and Biological Weapons Control and Warfare Elimination Act, new export restrictions on items that could be used for biological agent and chemical production, and visa restrictions.
Press Secretary Jen Psaki repeated U.S. demands for Navalny's release. The opposition leader's arrest set off nationwide street protests in Russia last month. Navalny contends his jailing is politically motivated. The U.S. sanctions were coordinated with European partners and Britain, but not specifically directed at President Vladimir Putin or the oligarchs of his inner circle.
Russia is a huge country. It has a lot of ways to influence the events in many parts of the world. So I understand that the only thing that Biden administration could do is to send signals. These are strong signals, but these are just signals. This is not something that has a material effect.
The White House denies the sanctions are largely symbolic. Responding to VOA, Psaki acknowledged it is important to maintain relations with Moscow on many issues, including on the Iran nuclear negotiation.
Russia is a P5+1 partner. They were as we pursued the JCPOA under the Obama-Biden administration, and they certainly would be a key partner if that diplomatic process were to move forward. So the point is, there are areas where we disagree. There are areas where there's significant challenge. There are also areas where we are going to work with the Russians, as we would with most global partners, when we need to take steps that are in the interest of the United States.
Last month, President Joe Biden said that unlike his predecessor, he has made clear to Putin that the U.S. will no longer tolerate Russian aggressive actions, including election interference, cyber attacks, and the poisoning of its citizens. But analysts say Biden's policy toward Russia must allow room for engagement in areas of mutual interest.
This includes arms control, a positive environmental and economic agenda in the Arctic, to some extent climate change, and a couple of regional theaters where we both have troops, including in Syria. So there's a need to work with Russia on a range of issues, and I think the Biden administration will pursue both cooperation and try to reestablish clear lines of what they regard as appropriate norms of international behavior.
Meanwhile, Moscow has already vowed to retaliate against the sanctions. Patsy Widakuswara, VOA News.
From economic sanctions to retaliation over Russia's recent suspected hacking of several U.S. government agencies, the international community is closely watching the Biden administration's next steps regarding U.S.-Russia policy. Matthew Rojansky is the director of the Kennan Institute at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. He is a leading analyst on U.S.-Russia relations, and I asked him where that relationship is headed next.
Well, look, this is a challenged relationship. From the U.S. perspective, we've seen a tremendous amount of troubling behavior from the Russian side. I think most salient for most people is interfering in U.S. elections, a constant barrage of social media propaganda, other forms of interference, attempts to sort of exploit divisions that already exist in our country, create new ones, exacerbate them. A lot of false information being trafficked via both Russian state media and unofficial mouthpieces, and then hacking. We've seen a tremendous amount of hacking, as well as the kind of more far-flung foreign policy issues. Russian support for proxies who are making trouble in various spots around the world, be it Syria, Libya, or of course Ukraine.
There's been a lot of response from in Europe and the United States to the poisoning of Navalny. There have been sanctions that the Biden administration has imposed on many high-ranking officials in Russia, but not on Putin or his inner circle. Why not?
Well, I think there are a number of sanctions that target senior members of the Russian security services. Well, when you mention that Putin himself is not under sanctions, that may not be the biggest threat. A far bigger threat would obviously be preventing the Russian state from borrowing any money on international markets. And the United States, together with its allies and partners, would have a significant capability to erode Russia's ability to finance the Russian state.
We're less than 100 days into a new presidential administration, President Biden. We've just completed 4 years with President Trump. Is there a difference so far, and it may be too early for the Biden administration to have sort of a policy with Russia, but is there a difference in how the two administrations are dealing with, or did deal with, Russia?
Well, at the outset, there's a significant difference in tone, message, and in setting expectations. Recall that, President Trump's message from day one was he wants to fix the relationship. He wants to get along with Russia. He likes and respects Vladimir Putin. He sought these one-on-one meetings with Putin. And President Biden has said, if anything, the opposite, right? He said, he's clear-eyed and realistic. He has talked about the threat from Russia. He's talked about important business that needs to get done. And in fact, he's gotten that done by pursuing a 5-year extension of the New START Strategic Nuclear Arms Treaty. And within 1 week of taking office, President Biden called President Putin. They both orally agreed to extend the deal, and they followed up immediately with the paperwork and the legislative steps required to do it. So, on balance, as you say, less than 100 days into the administration, the rhetoric seems to be a lot more realistic given Russia's actual behavior and the state of the relationship. None of the kind of highfalutin expectations of resets or, a good personal rapport between the two leaders. But in terms of deliverables, it's impressive that the administration has actually extended the New START treaty.
So where is the U.S.-Russia relationship headed, if you can look into a crystal ball?
Well, look, the message from the Russian side is this is a spoiled relationship. You can't spoil an already spoiled relationship. So in that sense, it's almost like a rock bottom kind of message. You can only go up from here. Maybe that's cockeyed optimism. The message from Washington, though, I think kind of reinforces that by saying, look, we're not going to set unrealistically high expectations. We're not going to become friends. We're not going to become partners. If you follow that line forward, you could imagine the relationship on balance being in a better place 4 years from now than it is today.
That's all the time we have. Thanks to my guests, Matthew Rojansky and Christo Grozev. Stay up to date with the latest news at voanews.com and follow me on Twitter @Greta. Thank you for being plugged in.
¿Qué tal, amigos? Reciban un fuerte y caluroso abrazo. Nosotros siempre desde aquí, desde la ciudad espacial, desde Houston, Texas, originando nuestro programa Lending Today toda la semana con toda la energía, la mejor actitud, la disposición. Y por supuesto vamos a saludar, me emocioné tanto, vamos a saludar a la bella, guapa y hermosa María Rebollar. María, es un placer compartir el día de hoy contigo un nuevo capítulo aquí del programa Lending Today.
Gracias, Gustavo. No, gracias a ti, a Now Media TV, gracias a el grupo de Heraldo Media Group por la invitación, por tenerme en el programa. Siempre es un honor para mí, Gustavo, compartir lo que conozco, mi sabiduría, mis experiencias, lo que somos con GoQuest Group. So, gracias por sintonizarse, a usted también.
Así es, recuerden que nos pueden ver a través de Now Media, Canal 21, el primer canal bilingüe en Texas, y nos ven en todos los estados de México a través del Heraldo Media Group, y también en Apple TV, Roku TV, Amazon Prime y por supuesto en Facebook y en YouTube. Y también ya nos han pedido, María, la idea es que María nos va a estar acompañando aquí. Vamos a estar alternando este programa también. Vamos a hacer uno en inglés, vamos a hacer uno en español, porque tenemos que llegarle a todas las comunidades también para que podamos venderle propiedades. María, pero el día de hoy hablemosle a nuestra audiencia y nuevamente, ¿qué es GoQuest Group?
Así es, bueno, pues para nosotros un placer. GoQuest Group es un mortgage broker, real estate brokers, o somos licenciados en la área de préstamos. Tenemos el equipo correcto para ayudarte a encontrar la casa igual. Hemos estado digo hemos porque pues son parte, es mi broker. El principal shareholder de GoQuest Group es un colombiano, Miguel Sánchez, nuestro CEO, que es pues latino, hablamos español, tenemos las licencias adecuadas donde nosotros te podemos ayudar en todo tipo de bienes raíces, pero no tan solo una propiedad, una casa. Somos una mortgage broker que también hacemos SBA loans. De eso podemos hablar, que es un SBA loan. Podemos ayudarte a comprar no tan solo una casa, sino que pedir dinero para que puedas tú empezar un negocio. So we're a fully licensed mortgage broker, a fully licensed real estate broker, y me encanta que es un programa bilingüe porque a veces se me sale lo inglés o
el
las...
Spanglish se te sale. Óyeme, María, algo muy importante, y me encontré ayer con unas personas en Miami y me preguntaban, Gustavo, hablen un poco de las licencias que tienen ustedes allí en GoQuest Group, porque eso es muy importante. ¿Cuáles son nuestras credenciales, nuestros certificados que tenemos allí en GoQuest Group?
Bueno, pues no son certificados, pero sí es importante saber que tienes que tener, para que seas un mortgage broker, tienes que tener licencias con el Estado. Entonces nosotros, ¿qué es un mortgage broker? Me encanta que me preguntes eso porque es un programa educativo y queremos que nosotros creemos que el mejor tipo de consumidor es un consumidor educado. Así es que para cuando tú estés listo para hacer un préstamo y quieras conseguir dinero en los Estados Unidos, la diferencia de un mortgage broker, que estamos licensed por el estado de Texas, la diferencia es de que tú puedes ir a un banco Y tenemos, entonces un banco te hace un préstamo basado en sus aprobaciones de ellos o sus guidelines de ellos. Todos usamos los mismos tipos de programa, no hay diferentes programas, por ejemplo, un FHA loan o un préstamo convencional. Entonces, para que tú ofrezcas estos tipos de préstamos, tienes que pasar por las licencias correctas. Pero lo que me encanta de Gold Quest Group también es que estamos acreditados por el Better Business Bureau. So, si tú buscas Better Business Bureau, tenemos uno, es como un grado en la escuela, puntajes excelentes, y a mí me encanta ser parte de un grupo de personas que tienen no tan solo ética, lo demuestran por las certificaciones. Será grado del estado que ellos nos dan ese como tipo puntaje, Gustavo. Entonces, somos un fully licensed mortgage broker, fully licensed real estate broker. Solo pasamos por licencias con el estado, solo las tenemos.
O sea, lo que estamos diciendo, palabras más, palabras menos, es que estamos catalogados dentro de la industria con un score o un puntaje bastante importante, donde le cumplimos a la gente, donde hemos sido responsables, donde tenemos credibilidad, donde no hemos tenido quejas, reclamos por parte de alguno de nuestros clientes, y esto nos ha permitido este gran reconocimiento, y yo lo digo, ser la compañía número 1 aquí en Houston y en los Estados Unidos con Gold Quest Group, María.
Así es. Bueno, Gustavo, pues para mí es un honor, porque aparte de que somos un prestamista acreditado y estamos con las licencias correctas con el estado, también somos un private money lender, y somos el private money lender le decimos en inglés, para que se me salga en español. We are one of Texas best private money lenders by volume, porque hacemos los préstamos más grandes de volumen. En otras palabras, financiamos hospitales, financiamos oil rig companies, financiamos todo tipo de préstamos con dinero privado. Entonces, sí somos es el número 1 en the highest private money lender in Texas by volume.
Espérenme, porque hablamos de que íbamos a empezar programas en inglés, y María hoy está a full con el inglés. Sí, correcto. Prestamos para gas station, para hospitales, para las refinerías o las compañías petroleras, para aviones, pero no se me preocupen de que es dinero, el dinero que se presta es dinero pesado, que le llaman, ¿no? O sea, se puede prestar también para comprar su vivienda, así que no se preocupen, eso lo vamos a hablar más adelante, ¿no, María? En las propiedades también la gente dirá, pero bueno, esto ya son grandes ligas y me están hablando de ir a hacer un proyecto en la refinería. No se preocupen, que también pueden comprar su casa.
Así es, pues a mí siempre me gusta animar a la comunidad latina que piensen en más grande. Y sabes otro también, Gustavo, para que los que no nos hayan visto anteriormente, our IT guy, Jonathan, is going to put on the screen the website de Gold Quest Group. Bueno, nuestro técnico va a poner ahorita en la pantalla la website de Gold Quest Group. Allí tú puedes ver la experiencia de Gold Quest Group. Tenemos más de 20 años en esta industria, Gustavo. Te habla de las licencias que tenemos, te habla de quién somos. Y pues sí, como dice Gustavo, no queremos asustarle, que digan, no, hombre, estos me vienen hablando de millones, de hospitales, de aviones, pero es que pues tenemos que tener ese plan donde si ahí está la pantalla ya, Gustavo, son los que quieran saber, solo se van a Home y se van a About Us, y ahí te enseña todo lo de las licencias, te enseña toda la información de Gold Quest Group, y bueno, también es súper fácil para que puedas animarte a que apliques para tu préstamo. Puedes hacerlo allí. Estamos muy innovados. We are so innovative. Donde ya podemos hacer todo en línea, y también te da testimonios. No tan solo los que hablamos de billones de dólares, pero también de personas que están comprando su casa
María,
por primera vez.
Porque eso es lo mejor, y me encanta porque ya la aplicación se puede hacer online, ya no hay necesidad de que vayan hasta la oficina, y eso nos ayuda, María, a agilizar el proceso definitivamente, porque cuando llegan a la oficina ya saben cuáles son los documentos que deben de llevar, y poner allí sobre la mesa para que iniciemos todo este proceso y aceleremos y les ayudemos a ver cómo les ayudamos definitivamente a ajustar este préstamo para que puedan hacer su proyecto de tener una casa aquí o un proyecto más grande como tú siempre has animado a la comunidad hispana.
Así es, Gustavo. No, pues definitivamente que les animo porque sabemos que nosotros somos el autor de nuestro libro y hay que soñar en grande. Así es que mira, si quieres comprar tu casa por primera vez, permítenos ayudarte. No tan solo estamos en Houston, Gustavo. La otra vez estabas en Miami y ya te estoy viendo con tu glow que tienes en tu skin, que algo le vi diferente, pues se fue al solecito de Miami. Cerramos una propiedad de Miami recién. No importa dónde tú estés, en qué estado. Estamos nuestro headquarters está aquí, nuestra corporación está aquí en Houston, Texas, pero podemos hacer un préstamo donde sea que tú estés. Y pues bueno, vamos a hablar un poquito entonces de qué es el proceso de comprar una casa, pero antes de que veas el proceso, our IT, Jonathan, is going to show us a house that we currently have on the market. So, él nos va a demostrar una casa que tenemos en el mercado, Gustavo.
Sí.
Entonces, pero para que la gente se anime, no es nada más de mirar esta foto, sino que empiecen a visualizarte con una casa nueva. Puedes comprarla ya sea nueva o ya, depende de tu presupuesto, ¿verdad? Entonces, en este caso es una casa que está en Memorial, que Memorial es un lugar súper reputable, donde las escuelas son tremendas, está cerca de galería, está cerca de los freeways más populares, una área muy buena.
María, mientras que Jonathan se acomoda, sabes que yo he estado viajando por algunos otros estados y lo que me he podido dar cuenta es de que definitivamente las casas aquí en Houston son casas muy bonitas. Yo he visto arquitectura muy antigua en otros sitios, no voy a decir porque no quiero meterme en líos, pero definitivamente Houston tiene una arquitectura muy bonita, hay casas nuevas, a pesar de que es un estado que lleva muchos años, pero aún se encuentran construcciones nuevas, María.
Claro que sí, pues fíjate, en este caso, pues si la gente quiere buscar una casa, como dices, todo el mundo tiene diferentes gustos. Hay gente que le gusta ese estilo de anticuado o más antigua. Pero en este caso estamos hablando, Gustavo, de esta propiedad que fue custom built de Citro Homes, uno de nuestros builders preferidos. Y todavía aún hay tiempo, la están mirando así porque hay tiempo todavía de construirla a tu gusto. Esta casa sí está en una área, ojo, eso sí es bien importante, la área donde tú estás comprando casas. Esta propiedad está en Memorial, ¿verdad?
Pero espérame, María, espérame, porque aquí yo me empiezo a emocionar y la gente está preguntando, ¿se necesita un down payment muy grande para esta casita?
Sí, vamos a hablar del proceso de todas las propiedades, pero sí, Gustavo, hay dos tipos de préstamos, pero en este caso ya les voy a explicar el préstamo, pues sí necesitan un down payment. En esta ilustración lo que les quería decir es, por ejemplo, esta casa, Gustavo, si la compran en Memorial, esta casa le va a costar $1 millón. Esta casa está 4,000 pies cuadrados. Wow. Es una casa enorme de 4 recámaras, 4 baños. Y lo que estaba buscando era buscarte y enseñarte la misma casa, pero en otra zona. Entonces, si tú compras esta casa, vamos a poner en el 10 de Houston. Entonces, puedes construirla, puedes comprar un terreno aún todavía como 60. Ese terreno en particular, primero le ayudamos a un inversionista que él compró este terreno, le costó el terreno $250,000 porque es Memorial. Sí. Entonces, el costo para construirla no te cuesta más si estás en otra área. Entonces, esta misma casa la puedes construir en I-10 East, la área, o bueno, cualquier otra área más affordable, y la puedes construir como por $300,000-400,000. Bueno, no considera...
Como todo, depende del área, ¿no, María?
Sí, así es. Tiene el Gustavo,
depende del área donde uno quiera construir, porque hay terrenos que son muy económicos, pero pues tú puedes construir una casa al gusto que quieras, ¿no? Pero María, como es bien le gusta, ¿dónde te encantaría construir una casa?
No, en Houston, Texas. Yo crecí en Houston, Texas, pero no, yo he visitado California, es hermosísimo. Nada más que allá me da miedo los earthquakes, acá me da miedo los tornados, ¿no? No, para mí yo prefiero estar en un lugar donde puedo ver todos los seasons. Y no, Houston, bueno, no es para desanimarte si tú quieres Houston. De verdad, Houston también es muy hermoso, hay mucho que hacer.
A la montaña donde está el sign que dice Hollywood.
No, pero sí, definitivamente, Gustavo, sí les animo de que ellos pueden construir, nuestra audiencia puede construir una casa. Si es que la quieres nueva, no te tiene que costar $1 millón, pero si te gusta esta, llámame que no va a durar. Estamos hablando con nuestro cliente, ponerlo como tipo Airbnb, o